In this lesson of JavaScript the Basics, we're going to look at what happens when JavaScript primitives act like objects, or as Angus Kroll says, the secret world of JavaScript primitives. Remember when we talked about JavaScript being made of primitives and objects? Primitives are strings, numbers, booleans, null, undefined, and with ES6, symbols. And everything else in JavaScript are objects. But if you have noticed, we have ran into several times in which primitives have done what only objects can do. Let's look at the following code. var welcome equals the string good to see you. Var shout welcome is assigned the value of welcome.toUppercase method. The variable welcome is a storage container containing a string of good to see you. Welcome is storing a primitive. In our next line of code, we see that we have created a variable called shoutWelcome, and to the shoutWelcome variable, we are storing the variable welcome containing a string primitive, and we are attaching the method toUppercase to that. Hold on, aren't methods only attached to objects? How can the string stored inside of welcome, which we've discussed is a primitive, be treated like an object? Strings aren't the only primitives that function like objects either. Booleans and numbers do this as well. You have access to properties their object equivalent exposes. Another term for that is their object wrapper. Let's keep the focus on strings in this lesson. We've already seen in our first example that strings can be treated as objects. We have built objects previously using object literal notation. We do that by using opening and closing curly braces. For example, if we want to build a car, we can name a variable called car and assign it the value of opening and closing curly braces. But that isn't the only way to make an object. Remember the object function constructor? In the case of making a string object, we might do this. This actually is an object function constructor. Its only purpose is to create objects. If we were to go into our console and look at the two strings we have created, we have welcome and we have superhero. One is a string primitive we created, and the other is a string object that we created. But our superhero variable is much more complex. Let's look visually at what is happening with superhero. We have superhero pointing to the string Superman, but we also find that we point to the prototype of the string object that exists. The string object has a whole set of properties and methods it can access. We saw earlier that it can access the toUppercase method, and the string object is able to access the properties that its own prototype, the object prototype, possesses. The object prototype doesn't have a prototype that it points to. Maybe this will help you see why JavaScript is referred to as an object-oriented language. It's okay if this is still a little bit foggy for you. For now, just know that the object form of any primitive carries with it a lot of functionality. So why does knowing this matter? And what does it have to do with a string that we create as a primitive? Knowing that strings have an object type or wrapper is helpful to know because it takes away the mystery of how you can attach a method to what appears to be a primitive. So now, let's go back to looking at how a string, which is a primitive, can access properties and methods on it. Let's take our original variable welcome that contains a primitive string of good to see you. We can access the length of this string by using the length property, even though it was created as a primitive string and not a string object. While evaluating welcome.length, JavaScript will convert your primitive string into an object. For a moment in time, your primitive string will become an object to figure out what the length of your string actually is. This is only temporary. You receive the evaluation for length, a number, and the welcome variable still as a string primitive. However, if you create a string object, as in the case of superhero, it will remain permanently as an object. Primitives can move from primitive to objects and then back to primitives. Objects can't do that dance. To verify that our welcome variable has returned back to a string after temporarily becoming an object to access the length property, we can use the type of operator and welcome, and the result we get is string. We can then use the type of operator on welcome.length, which returns a number. So in that moment, the welcome primitive has become an object that we can attach the .length property to. But when we look at our welcome again, we are back to the string primitive. If we run through the same process with our superhero, we will see that it starts as an object and remains an object. As a result of this lesson, you should now know why and how primitives behave like objects when they have to. It is very unusual to use the object function constructor to make a string. Why? Because you don't need to. To save space, the JavaScript engine will convert your string into an object to access its properties and methods when necessary, then return that object back into a primitive. This will save memory consumption. Objects are bigger than primitives. So when we can just convert to an object when we need to, we keep a low memory footprint. So when should you use an object function constructor to create a string object? Not often, because JavaScript is more than happy to do that work for you. Thanks for joining me in this lesson of looking at the secret world of JavaScript primitives.